I guess we can start. So welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for being here today. It is a great pleasure to have here with us Konrad Borowicz. He's associate assistant professor from University, or soon enough, from the University of Tilburg, where he specializes in financial regulation and technology. It is especially a great pleasure to have him here today with us, because this is one of those academic connections that have been born during the pandemic primarily. So we find each other on two different sides of the world. Me with Professor Douglas Arner here in Hong Kong and our team, and then Konrad based in Tilburg. And we realized we were working in similar area of interest, in particular the connection with data, open banking, data governance, and of course, artificial intelligence in the context of finance. And so we started to communicate, and then finally the pandemic is over, and we're very happy to welcome here Konrad, which today is going to talk to us about open finance, artificial intelligence, and data quality. Without further ado, I leave the floor to Konrad. And please be warned before that while we'll talk for around 30 minutes, is very happy to receive any question anytime. So feel free to interrupt and raise your hand if you want to ask something. Konrad, the floor is yours.
Giuliano, thank you so much. Very pleased to be here. HKEU law is really one of the most interesting places to do the research on financial regulation, fintech. The work that Professor Arner, Giuliano are doing has really been inspiring. I was very pleased to have and contribute to an event I organized last year. The education on fintech and financial regulation is also a source of inspiration for me. So I'm really delighted to be able to finally meet them in person, to be at HKU Law, and also present this paper, which is still in the making. So I'm hoping for some feedback from the audience here in Hong Kong. So the title is Open Finance, Artificial Intelligence, and Data Quality. And it really is a European perspective on this topic, but I'm going to make also some remarks that sort of transcend the European context to try and establish and make some connections as well. I'm going to start with a brief overview of the statement and the main points that I want to get across, and then I'll go into a more detailed sort of discussion. So we all know about artificial intelligence, its transformative potential across different sectors, including finance. So we don't need to spend much time on this. But what is also clear to even people who don't know that much about the technical aspects of AI is that the development and deployment of AI requires substantial volumes of training and testing data, which poses significant challenges in terms of the availability of that data, as well as the quality of that data. The policy frameworks, the existing and evolving policy frameworks, focus a lot on the problem of availability, but at least in the financial context, not so much on the problem of quality. This is the sort of motivating observation that I made, having examined those frameworks in quite some detail. There's the question, of course, should policymakers be concerned about the problem of data quality itself? Perhaps this is something that the industry can take care of by itself. I want to suggest today that there are reasons to be skeptical. Number one, it is very, very costly to develop to sort of source, acquire, collect, structure high quality data. It's a very costly endeavor. And secondly, to the extent that financial data used for the training of AI is shared, there's required some sort of coordination and collaboration on part of the different players, stakeholders, in terms of standardization, for example. Right? So there's this cost and coordination problem that I would suggest the industry by itself cannot solve. So my main thesis today is that data quality is a problem. It's a policy problem, so essentially a market failure. And what I mean by data quality as a policy problem is that it is simply unclear whether the data that is being used for AI development is fit for the purpose, whether it's accurate, whether it's complete, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a major problem. And if that is the case, if data quality is indeed a problem, the quality of the data used for AI training, then AI-driven decision-making, whether in the private or public context, can be distorted, illegitimate, lead to market concentration, and create other kinds of problems that, again, I think policymakers should be acutely aware of. So in this paper, I adopt a sort of comparative institutional analysis of the different frameworks or mechanisms that either exist or could be leveraged to address this problem. So these frameworks include AI regulation, the AI Act in the European context, the final version of which has been leaked only a few days ago. So this is actually, the presentation will be based on that version. Privacy regulations, like in the European context, the GDPR, liability frameworks, standard private law liability frameworks such as contract law and tort law, and open finance frameworks. So in the paper, I look at these different in a comparative fashion to see which one is most suitable, most sort of efficient, cost-effective to address this problem. And the main finding is essentially that the open finance framework, which I will talk about later on in more detail, could be a good basis, could provide a foundational governance sort of mechanism to foster collaboration and shared responsibility for data quality. Okay, just to be clear, that framework is currently not used for that purpose. It is mainly used for the purpose of fostering data sharing, but I want to suggest that it can also be used to help address the problem of data quality. So this is the main sort of thesis finding of this paper. Okay, so now to go into some more detail, this is the overview of the talk. I'll talk a little bit about data and AI in finance, this problem of availability and quality. I will talk about the policy frameworks for data availability in the EU, and data quality. I'll outline some policy recommendations and talk a little bit about future research. Okay, so we know that potentially, at least, AI has a multitude of applications in the financial context. So one is credit scoring. We know that to the extent a financial institution has access to a lot of high quality data, it can develop a good credit scoring system, which can be very helpful in making lending decisions. So that's one major application, and potentially fraud detection. So AI systems can also be trained to detect payment fraud, instances of payment fraud. That's another commonly sort of discussed application of AI in finance. AI models can be trained to provide advice. They can be trained to provide financial analysis, which can then be used in the investment process. So there's a whole, these are obviously just a few examples, but potentially there's quite a few. I have highlighted credit scoring and fraud detection because some of the frameworks that I will talk about specifically address these. So I will mostly focus on these two applications of artificial intelligence in finance. What kind of AI is being involved? For the most part, when we talk about AI in the financial context, we're talking about machine learning, supervised machine learning algorithms, which are calibrated to match predictions that the models are making with the supposedly correct data. So you need correct data to make sure that the predictions that the model is making are accurate. Okay. Now, as any researcher and certainly a data scientist would know, it is not easy to have access to correct data, okay, to good data, to high quality data. Computer scientists have struggled with this problem for years. Researchers obviously struggle with this problem as well. This is something we can easily, I think, relate to. So what are those problems exactly? Simply put, I think the problems are essentially data availability and data quality problems. And in this paper, I distinguish or sort of talk about how these problems manifest themselves differently, okay, at these sort of incumbent or legacy financial institutions. So think about, traditional banks, right? And those institutions that seek to challenge them. So let's call them fintech providers or challengers, okay? So I think the problems are somewhat different at these two types of institutions, and the policy frameworks address these problems in different ways. So let's talk about incumbent institutions, so traditional banks, legacy banks, your HSBCs and so on. There's certain things that we need to keep in mind when we think about banks and data. I can call them stylized facts, right? So one is, and that's a pretty historical point, but I think it's an important one. Historically, banking was a branch-based business. Okay, so data, about you as a bank customer was really held on the bench, and only at certain times during the week, or maybe at the end of the day, would be distributed to a central sort of server. But in its essence, banking was, and to some extent still is, a branch-based business, right? Second sort of stylized fact that is important to keep in mind is that, there's a lot of merger and acquisition type activity in the banking industry. And because banks are, huge institutions, it is not easy to merge the data infrastructure of these institutions. So a great example is the merger of Deutsche Bank and Postbank in Germany. It took 13 years to merge the databases, customer databases, just basic payment account information, right, in Germany for Deutsche Bank. Okay, so 13 years to merge the data of formerly Postbank customers with Deutsche Bank customers. It's a huge challenge. And then on top of that, these days you have people accessing mostly banking through apps, right? So that's yet another sort of system that is being used to collect and aggregate data. The point being that at a financial institution like HSBC, banking, data, you should not assume that data is held or kept at one place, that it's in the same format, that it can be easily accessed by anyone at any time or easily transferred. It's a very complicated process. Obviously, banks are aware of that problem. They have developed these data warehouses over time, which are designed to aggregate the data. But again, that data, depending on what it is, where it comes from, can be in different formats. That makes it difficult, even for a sophisticated data warehouse infrastructure, to meaningfully aggregate it. There's also this concept of a data lake. Okay, so data lakes are pools of data that, unlike a data warehouse, are unstructured. So data warehousing, is designed to sort of aggregate and store structured data. So data that is in the same, format and is standardized. Data lakes are pools of data that are unstructured. Why would firms, not just financial firms, but also financial firms, rely on data lakes? They can be very helpful for training of AI models, essentially, okay? Because, you can probably get a lot of more interesting results from an unstructured pool of data than in many cases, structured data. So that's why you have them, but obviously that raises data quality problems, right? If we have unstructured data, AI models being trained on data from a data lake, which is unstructured, that creates data quality problems. Which, again, more likely an incumbent big financial solution is going to have, okay? All right, moving on to the fintech challenger world. These guys need to rely on data that is provided essentially from incumbents, right? So it is very rare for them to have their own data. They can have their own data, but oftentimes they will rely on data acquired from, your HSBCs, other legacy institutions. Obviously, these legacy institutions don't have the incentive to share that data. Okay, that data is the source of their competitive advantage, so we should not assume that they will share this data. That's why you have these open finance frameworks, which Professor Arner and Professor Castellano have written, several really interesting papers about this whole idea of data sharing. In some jurisdictions, data sharing between incumbents and challengers is mandatory. This is the case in the EU. But in other contexts, in the US, for example, it's not. And here I understand the situation is more like the US situation as well, if I'm not mistaken, but correct me if I'm wrong. So it is not immediately apparent that these challenges will have access to this data, that the data will be available to them. So if they want to develop AI applications, they will face this problem of data availability. There's also the technical issue of how these fintech challengers access this data. Historically, they would do that through the practice of the so-called screen scraping. So essentially, a user would share the login credentials, your username and password with that institution, and they will use these credentials to access this data. So they will technically log into your account with your information and just extract the data and scrap the data. That obviously raises cybersecurity issues. We are all sort of mindful of what kind of cybersecurity risk the sharing of your credentials, bank account access information creates. So that's one of the reasons why this practice has been banned in a number of jurisdictions, including the UK and the US and the EU. But it's still quite prominent, for example, in the US. The alternative is reliance on the so-called APIs, application programming interfaces, which does not require, so that sort of mode of access to data does not require you to share your access credentials, but it does require the financial industry to develop the infrastructure, the API infrastructure that will allow challengers to rely on to access data from incumbent institutions. But again, here's a quality problem, because as a challenger, even if we assume the ideal world where the APIs are standardized and you can go to every incumbent and ask them for the data, and let's assume they'll give you the data, you don't know what kind of data you're going to get. You don't know if it's going to be of high quality. You don't know if it's going to be in the format that you will find useful, right? So again, we have a data quality problem. So again, the point here being that the data availability and quality problems manifest themselves in a somewhat different way, depending on what kind of a player you are in this financial sort of ecosystem. How are these problems addressed? Again, the data availability problem, I think, occupies the policymakers' minds, to a much greater extent. The so-called open banking and open access framework, open finance frameworks, are meant to address or designed to address specifically this problem. They have the goal of essentially increasing data availability and they do that by promoting data sharing. Number one, they determine the scope of data that can be shared, okay? Number two, they determine access conditions, including security measures that have to be observed when the data is accessed. And third, certainly some open finance frameworks also provide or set out various governance arrangements designed to foster collaboration between different stakeholders in the system. So for example, the API standardization point, that requires some extent of collaboration. Open finance frameworks sometimes do that as well. They don't have to, but they sometimes try to do that. So I'll say just a few words about the European Open Finance Framework, which really has its origins in the Payment Services Directive, a second one from 2015. This is the legal instrument, the sort of piece of legislation that allowed customers, bank customers, to request and require their financial institutions to share payment account information, so information about your basic payment account, to share that data with third parties. Okay, so these third parties may be, payment services providers. So in the European context, maybe you've heard of Revolut, maybe if you heard of Wise. There's probably a few others. I mean, there's a few others, and there's payment services providers all around the world, including here in Hong Kong, even though I actually don't know what their names are. But that was the framework that allowed you to request that the data be shared, and in that way enjoy the services, the beneficial services that these payment services providers were offering. Now the Payment Services Directive is being revamped, but the basic sort of scope in that respect doesn't change. you can share or request your bank to share your payment accounts data with others. There's a more recent instrument which has not yet been adopted. It's called the Proposal for Financial Data Access Directive, which expands the scope of this sort of open finance framework to other types of data. So pursuant to this framework, it is no longer bank account information, but also information about your mortgage credit agreements, about your loans, about your savings, investments, your crypto and real estate, your pension rights, no life insurance, as well as various other data that forms part of a creditworthiness assessment of a firm, not a consumer. So data about the creditworthiness of consumer were excluded from this framework because there were concerns about how this data will be used and how this will impact financial inclusion. But again, the basic point here is that there exists this open finance framework in the European context. It exists in other jurisdictions as well in a different sort of scope that allows you to transfer or sort of share your data with third parties, and the scope of that data is increasing. There are the security measures, which are not that relevant for my talks. I'm going to skip over that. But the main point here is that the open finance framework in the EU also provides for security measures. What kind of security measures banks need to sort of apply to allow data sharing. And then there's this more interesting third aspect of open finance frameworks in the EU, and it is quite unique, I think, from a comparative perspective. Namely, and that is part of the financial data services regulation. So basically, PSD2, so the Payment Services Directive 2, which set sort of the stage for open finance in Europe, did not provide a governance framework for collaboration of different actors. Okay, so that is one of the reasons why the framework has not been deemed as successful as it could have been. To the extent that collaboration between different actors was required, for example, to allow for API standardization, the industry had to take care of it itself. And these efforts were somewhat successful, but not entirely successful. This is why this new open finance framework, this broader open finance framework, explicitly provides for the establishment of a governance arrangement requiring the industry stakeholders to collaborate, to set data and interface standards, to develop standardized contractual frameworks governing access to specific data sets, and collaboration, requiring them to collaborate to establish more generally governance rules in relation to data sharing. Okay, it's quite an interesting construct actually in this proposal for the directive, for the regulation. Essentially, what the European Commission has said is, we think it is really important for you, the industry, to collaborate on this, to develop these data sharing schemes, to develop these data sharing arrangements, and we want you to do that. And we are going to give you 18 months to do that. But if you don't do it, we will do it for you. So this is a very interesting strategically sort of, I think, approach. And this is how it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. But again, the focus is on data sharing. Very little about data quality so far in this open finance framework. Clearly, the problem of data availability, particularly for these challengers, for these fintech firms, for payment services providers, for others, is on the minds of policymakers. What about the problem of data quality? And before I talk about that, I should also mention, I haven't mentioned this, one of the important reasons why the open finance framework is being promoted is precisely to help the development of artificial intelligence applications. Okay? This is not explicitly provided for in those policy documents. They talk about innovation more generally, but it is pretty clear in the European context that the Commission hopes that this sort of broad, pretty hands-on mandatory open finance framework, data sharing framework, will help European startups, AI startups, gain a competitive edge against competitors from other jurisdictions with respect to development of AI applications. Okay, so clearly the AI revolution is in the back of this. And that's why data sharing and data availability is being promoted. What about data quality? Does the law regulate data quality, the quality of data that is used in AI? Now, I have to say that having looked at this, there's very little. Okay, there's very, very little in that regard. And where would we look for this? We have in the European Union a proposal for the AI Act. Okay, the final version of the proposal has been leaked just a few days ago. It has been in the making for quite a while. And one of the things that the AI Act does is distinguishes between different types of AI applications, and in particular distinguishes or sort of identifies these so-called high-risk AI systems. Okay, so these high-risk AI systems are essentially AI systems that are being used in different critical sort of contexts, right? So maybe in the healthcare sector, in the energy sector, in the infrastructure sector, and to some extent in the financial context, but in a very limited sense. So the high AI risk systems in the financial context basically are limited to systems that are designed to evaluate the credit worthiness, right, of a person. Okay? So only AI systems designed to evaluate the credit worthiness of an individual are designated as high risk systems in the AI Act. Okay, this is the only example of a financial application of AI that falls into this category. And what happens if a AI system falls into this category? There's certain strict sort of requirements, including with respect to data quality, that the developer of this AI system has to meet. Okay, so this is Article 10 of the AI Act. I'm not going to go through this, perhaps later on in the Q&A, or we have the time, but it is quite interesting because it talks about, so Article 10 talks a lot about data quality. What kind of data you can use, what kind of a process you should sort of apply to structure the data, to process the data, what kind of a governance arrangement you should have at your company to train the data, what kind of a framework you need to test the data. It's a pretty detailed prescriptive framework. But again, exclusively in the financial context for AI systems developed to assess the credit worthiness of an individual. So basically credit scoring, okay? So this is the only AI regulation that specifically addresses the problem of data quality in the EU that I am aware of. Obviously, there are other legal frameworks, more general legal frameworks that could be applicable. Okay, so a few examples, I've listed them here on the slide. Privacy law. So the GDPR, the European Privacy Data Protection Law, has this principle in it, the accuracy principle in Article 5. It basically states that the data you're processing must be accurate and where necessary up to date. Okay, that's very vague. It doesn't specify just how accurate does it have to be. Okay, and that's quite important when you think about data quality, because high quality data doesn't have to be perfectly accurate. So that I think is one of the, it'll be quite challenging to apply this principle in the context of data quality assessment in the AI training context, I think. In addition, to the extent that data being used for AI training is personal data, it can be quite easily anonymized, right? And that is the case, then GDPR doesn't apply. So I think the application of Article 5 of GDPR, I think has major limitations as a framework to sort of make sure that data quality is high in the AI training system. I know it's off question. Okay. Obviously, we can think about contract law. We can think about liability under tort law. as sort of ex post measures that could incentivize AI developers to rely on high quality data when training AI. But there's problems, I think, with the application of contract law. I mean, how do we make it's not always the case that the user of the AI system had a direct contractual arrangement with the AI developer, and without this, you couldn't establish liability under contract law. What law would be an option? But again, it is not entirely clear to me, even though I have a master thesis defense tomorrow about this. I'm hoping to learn from my master student. Maybe they understand the product liability framework better. It is not clear that the AI systems count as products within the framework of the product liability directive, which is basically the tort law framework in the EU. So again, yes, there are other laws that we could rely on to try and incentivize people to develop or rely on high quality data to train AI, but how effective would they be? I have some doubts that they would. And I also have some doubts that the incumbent firms in the financial industry have the incentives to do it themselves. Again, it is very costly to create high quality data sets. It is really a question of return on investment. I'm sure that in many cases, firms, banks will be incentivized to do that. But you can probably develop a good AI application on poor quality data, right? And who's going to find out and when? Again, I don't think that's I don't think we should rely exclusively on the incentive of purely business incentive of financial market participants. And again, even if we do, we still have this problem that we can be in a situation where this data is being used by someone else, and how costly will it be for that third party to restructure this data, determine that it's of high quality. We still have this problem, I think. Okay, so some policy recommendations that I would have, having looked at these different frameworks in a comparative fashion. Certainly in the EU context, but this is perhaps true of other jurisdictions as well, these open finance frameworks, which again are geared towards the development of AI systems, by and large, not just, obviously they're meant to foster innovation more generally, but AI is an important, obviously, dimension of financial innovation. They are geared towards the development of AI. I think they could be easily leveraged to foster development of data quality standards, to foster the development of conceptual frameworks for, what is high quality data, right? High quality data will mean something different in different contexts. It will mean something different in the financial context and in the health context. There'll be some similarities, but there might be some, idiosyncrasies as well. So I think we are in the need for the development of, a basic conceptual framework, and that has to be a joint stakeholder, a multi-stakeholder discussion involving people from both the private and public sector who can agree on what is their quality to start with. So maybe we can leverage these data sharing arrangements, these data sharing schemes to foster development of these data quality standards. Maybe we can also use these fora essentially to clarify questions and issues around allocation of liability, providing for dispute resolution. I think as a foundational governance structure, these data sharing schemes explicitly provided for under the European Open Finance Framework are a good starting point. I think they could provide, a pretty good institutional sort of base, and maybe in other contexts as well. But I don't think the open finance frameworks in other jurisdictions provide explicitly for these governance arrangements, contractual arrangements between different stakeholders in such an explicit fashion. So that would be my policy suggestion in the European context. Going beyond that, I think there is internationally a need for the development of this conceptual and normative framework for data quality, financial data quality. Having researched this topic a little bit, I think a framework like this, conceptual, normative framework, could be modeled after this 2011 Basel Committee for Banking Supervision document called Principles for Effective Risk Data Aggregation and Risk Reporting. Okay, so that is a document that was developed in the wake of the global financial crisis back in 2008, when policymakers realized that they don't actually require banks to, adhere to certain standards of data aggregation analysis, and that was one of the problems with, banks making one of the reasons why banks were making these, errors in their risk assessments. So it was deemed policymakers at the international level, policymakers at the Basel Committee for Banking Supervision, deemed this to be a good idea to develop this set of principles, but also conceptual framing of this problem, how banks should go about data aggregation, how they should go about the problem of how they should go about risk reporting to policymakers. So it's a very interesting document. I think it could be an important source of inspiration for what we are talking about here in terms of data quality. If you look at this document, you will see that there's certain principles in there related to things like governance. Okay, so what kind of a governance in terms of what kind of people you need to have to aggregate data effectively, at the institution, questions like this, issues of data architecture and IT infrastructure. What kind of infrastructure is appropriate? These are some of the principles. These are some of the things the principles address as well. But also questions of data accuracy and integrity, data completeness, timeliness, adaptability, comprehensiveness, clarity, usefulness, and frequency, all relevant dimensions of data quality, I think. So I don't think this document applies directly to this context, but I think, and I would plea, and I think this is going to be one of the recommendation of this paper is for the BCBC, because I think it'll be the right place, the right sort of group to develop something like that for data quality for the specific AI training context. Particularly because AI will not be just used in the private sector, but also in the public sector, in the, think about RegTech, the use of technology in the context of regulation, whether for compliance, anti-money laundering, fraud detection. It is an issue of great importance for public regulators as well. Okay, so this is sort of my policy sort of plea, policy sort of takeaway. And to sort of wrap this up, I'll just share some thoughts on future research. This is just basically some ideas for my own future research, but if people are interested in this or would like to explore this, I'd be happy to talk and learn from you also. So I think in general, open finance and AI have been two topics that have attracted the academic community, particularly people interested in financial regulation, quite a bit. So Professor Arner and Professor Castellano have written about open finance, developed this very interesting framework for thinking about data governance and open finance in a comparative perspective. Really very interesting work. Professor Arner, also prolific contributor on the topic of AI regulation. So clearly, open finance and AI are topics that we are all aware of. But I think the nexus of the two is quite interesting, and I think it has been neglected to a large extent by policymakers and academics alike. So I think it's an interesting one. Going forward, I would like to, and this is the idea for the next paper, is to do an empirical piece to see essentially how open finance frameworks have, if at all, affected the development of AI applications. Okay, and the European context, you can do this quite easily by investigating the business model and services offered by fintechs firms who have obtained licenses to do open finance. Okay, so if you want to do open finance, open banking specifically in the European context, and that's true also in other jurisdictions, you need to obtain a license, right? If you want to be a payment service provider, you need to obtain a license. So there's a list in every jurisdiction of those providers. So, my idea for this is to, look at that list, see what kind of businesses and services are they offering. What kind of businesses are they? What kind of services are they offering? Are they doing anything in terms of AI? And yes, what kind of AI? Is it, credit scoring? Is it financial fraud detection advice? And then see and talk to them and see what kind of problems they have encountered. Also in terms of data quality, I think that will give me a much better understanding. If this is a real problem, I mean, I think it is a real problem, but it is a real problem. But actually to try and see and measure, not in a quantitative fashion, but somewhat qualitative fashion, how big of a problem it is, and what are some of its sort of idiosyncrasies. What kind of data quality issues do they face? I think would be an interesting one. So this is my plan for the future, and that is a wrap. Thank you so much for your attention, and looking forward to some questions and a discussion.
Really mean to welcome Dr. Borowicz. Thank you very much. Really great presentation, and well, we're hoping for questions. And I immediately abuse of my chair privilege to actually raise a point, and I would like you to elaborate a bit more, but I won't take much time, so actually we can have more questions from the audience. First thing is it seems like you started the noting and you explained brilliantly how essentially, we have this problem of data availability and data quality, how it is connected with different areas, and how the open banking, open finance approach in the European Union might provide a policy framework to build on or list the reliable. But the first point is that I note is in the European framework, and I would like to know what you think about that, the policy objective is not yet clear. It's not yet completely in focus, because we can say, and then that's what, you've been telling us as well, that we have a data accessibility and data quality. But in the moment we can say there are the two broad policy objectives. But again, I would like to hear from you. What's your take on that? But then my second point here is that when we're looking at data quality, as you indicated, we don't have a clear definition, in a sense, and we might not have to, because you're pointing out the Basel Committee principles, but timelessness or accuracy, they might be relevant for certain aspects of finance, but might not be relevant for others. So in that regard, maybe one thing that I would like to hear from you more, and we can continue the conversation as well, is how can we define, can we systematize, even based on data science, what is meant technically, and then what data quality, because there is a technical definition that we know, but then there is some policy definition that might be different from that, and we might need them or not, I don't know, up to discuss. And then the second thing, like the incentive, how to promote data quality based on the definition. As you might say, economic incentives might not be necessary, but at the same time, why someone would have to go through a great length to meet some sort of a policy goal and then actually have to release the data without no compensation? And I stop here. So my point is pretty much around data quality. What do you think about the current framework, where we can go further, and what are the possible area of research that you're interested in?
No, thanks for these excellent questions. I mean, I should point out that this open finance framework that I talked about is part of the creation. It's part of the. So the Commission wants to create this thing called the European Financial Data Space. And as a matter of fact, it's not just a financial data space that Commission wants to create. It actually aims to create data spaces in other sectors as well. So energy, health, also mobility, and other sort of areas. And the basic idea here is that, in the last couple of years, we've had a number of policy instruments encouraging data sharing at the horizontal level, like the Data Act, Data Governance Act, but they have not been deemed enough. So the idea is that we need to go into the sectors, look at the sectors, see what the problems with data sharing are in different sectors, and address them very specifically. And that's that's the sort of overarching motivation. And the Commission in the financial context wants to achieve, greater data sharing in the financial context by expanding the scope of data that can be shared, by making sure that people feel comfortable sharing, so enhancing security measures, things like that. But I completely agree with this point that you made, that it is not clear, beyond like this basic talk of, we think data sharing is good. We think data sharing will foster innovation, right? But how will that innovation manifest exactly? Who will it benefit? What kind of impact will it have on market structure? These questions are not addressed at all. The question of data quality does not come up at all. I mean, it did come up in some ways because, as I mentioned, there was a concern that if we allow for the sharing of data that has been used to evaluate the creditworthiness assessment of an individual, that could impact financial inclusion. That is one example, pretty much the only one I could find where clearly there was some policy. I mean, clearly financial inclusion is something, but that's the only mention or sort of only dimension of this framework that even touches upon financial inclusion, right?
But also, sorry, you cannot even use any liability if you don't define what is data quality, because you do not meet any, what is the breach of a contract, or what is the breach of any, negligent part in case, that there is no clear-cut definition.
Absolutely. So that goes to your second point about, what definition, what conception of data quality do we adopt? Because there's clearly a technical one. There's a book about data quality by data scientists, right? Obviously, people who are training AI systems think about this a lot. But the way that they think about it isn't necessarily, and perhaps shouldn't be, the way that policymakers should think about it. So there's potentially a conflict there. But there's no, I have found, there's very limited discussion. I mean, people think about discrimination and bias. Yes, fine. So, we should sort of recognize that. So there's a little bit of literature in the literature on AI about discrimination and bias that could arise. But again, that is not explicitly part of the open finance frameworks at all. So I think we need to bring this conversation about data quality into the discussion of open finance, the goals of open finance. I think, we should do this as academics, in all jurisdictions, because I think it's a very important dimension of this debate that has been neglected by and large. The other question, how to implement it, I think it's an excellent one. As you said, if you don't have a clear definition of data quality, you cannot really count contract law or tort law as the right incentives, right? Because it's not clear at all that you can hold someone to a standard of behavior if you don't know what the standard is. So, maybe that standard will evolve through the court system, right? But I think that's probably not what we want. I mean, inevitably that will happen also. But I think, I think the approach of incentivizing the industry to try and address this issue in contracts and develop standardized sort of ways of allocating liability. Maybe that's one way to do it. But you have to be mindful that within those data sharing schemes, there'll be more powerful actors and less powerful actors. So can we be certain that the allocation of liability that will result from the discussions in those fora will be the sort of optimal from a what's called a social policy standpoint? This may not be what we want. So I think there's a limit to also relying on relying institutionally on the courts or on contracts to determine how liability is allocated for failure to train models, AI systems on high quality data.
Thank you. Any questions, please? Okay, we have the gentleman over there and the gentleman, please.
Thank you. I fear the focus on data quality is misguided based on the misconception that perfect data means perfect decision making. When you can make wrong decisions on perfect data, and correct decisions on imperfect data. What you want out of AI is to make decisions coping with imperfect data, because that's real life. It's not only AI, it's human decision making to make the best decision out of imperfect data. So you should accept imperfect data and also incomplete data. You never have complete data. So shouldn't the focus be on the AI decision-making side, not the data side?
You want to take the other? Oh,
Sure, let's take both.
let's take the second. If there is more, please just raise your hand and I mark you down. This is great, brilliant.
Thank you. Just from a library and information science perspective, because data quality is actually seriously studied in this field since the advent of computer. Like in University of Glasgow, they used to run a postgrad program in computer forensics and this and that. So only that. Yeah, here we're talking about open finance. I'm more familiar with open research, open science. It has very different motivations. Like universities, they get better data for boosting the rankings if they do open science seriously. But there's no comparable. There doesn't seem to be comparable incentive, or like if you don't comply with that, you'll be penalized. It doesn't apply to the financial world, and also that's just my little thought. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Well, let's start with these two, and then if we have time, we can get more.
I mean, clearly the policy focus should be, and is on the decisions made by AI systems as well. So I think, there will be instances in which, in the European context, to take the creditworthiness assessment example, right? Because the AI systems or automated systems are already being used to make these assessments and determinations. And there was a case coming out of the Court of Justice of the European Union recently, and now I'm blanking of the name of this case, but it came out of Germany. And essentially, the facts were that a borrower was denied a credit based on an automated assessment. So the decision was made based on this automated assessment. And the question there, trying to remember, but the question was either whether, he could challenge it and have someone else, a real person, take a look at it, or maybe the question was, I cannot remember exactly, whether, they could, I think he made a request to actually inspect the process that was sort of used to make this decision. And that request was denied. And the court, I think, allowed them to access this process and access this information. I can't remember, what the outcome exactly was. So which is unfortunate. But the bottom line is that clearly there's a focus on, what kind of rights should we give people or afford people who are affected in one way or another through automated decisions, made through AI or sort of other systems. But I think that should be an important focus of policy and the law. But I think that does not exclude a policy focus on data quality as well. Like I completely take the point that, you can have a good decision, based on an imperfect data, and you can make a bad decision based on perfect data. But I don't think that is a justification for not focusing on the data quality problem itself. What was the question here again? Sorry.
Just an additional perspective on data quality from library science perspective, because the data quality is something that the field values very highly since the advent of before, of course, everything's paper-based, and then we have multimedia collections, and then now there are lots of like university libraries, they all have research data depositories. These are fields that are also debated and also seriously studied. But of course, I'll acknowledge that there's a kind of disconnect of library science and data science, especially in a more commercial setting that's outside traditional academia. So it's sometimes like for open science or research data management, there's that and stick metaphor that kind of underpins the entire situation of research data management for in academic settings. So these are things that are currently running, and as for in private sector, it's sometimes my colleagues and I would just say that the let's say corporate libraries or archives, they are just burning money. They are they don't make profit for the corporations. That's why they are accorded the kind of priority that we know, and then it kind of resembles what I'm hearing in this afternoon, that there can't seem to be many actions if it's not resorting to compliance, legal compliance. That's just what I thought.
Yeah, so I think obviously the data quality problem is not new, right? And certainly in the financial context, governments have historically struggled with data about people who want to avoid paying taxes, right? Who don't want to disclose the fact that they don't comply with the law. There's problems with the delay in the provision of this data. There's problems of data standards and so on. Actually, the IMF Data Standards Initiative that was mentioned in your paper, which actually I was unaware of, and it sparked my interest. The Data Standards Initiative by the IMF. So obviously that is a major focus. But the point I'm trying to make, I think, in this paper is that problem is evolving as new uses of data are being found, right? Because the data quality problem ultimately is the problem of whether the data is fit for purpose, and the purposes change and evolve. And the use of data to train AI is a new purpose. So I think we need to rethink what data quality means in this context. How is that different? How is the policy definition of data quality different from a technical one, and how to implement it?
I think it's good. Let's just make a short example. Imagine that I, go to my bank and I ask for my financial data, payment data, to be transferred to an alternative lender that is supposed to do better loans, that I need for my business or whatever. In the process in which I'm transferring those data, and so I'm asking bank A, established financial institution, to move my data there, the bank might take out, for instance, some willingly, unwittingly, who knows, some information, and what maybe pop up mostly are 5 missed payment in the past 10 years. And then this data then is passed to this other institution, who will deny me the loan. And so I have to go back to my previous one. So the data technically is correct. There is just a problem of liability, responsibility, economic incentive, that the data might be passed is not fully accurate, depending on how we define it, even if the information is truthful. So there might be this sort of situation when you have an open banking that requires one large incumbent to transfer the data somewhere else, but there is no check on what is the type of data quality, which might be simply be matching with, or might be some other definition. That's something that I think Konrad make us all think about, how to match different scientific definition, legal definition, policy goals, and so on and so forth. So with that said, please join me to thank again Dr. Borowicz, and thank you so much.
Thanks for coming.